Chapter 21b. The afternoon was dragging towards its mellow hour. The sun was deepening the gold on its lances. The bees were going home, and the birds were flying past less often. Deacon and Mary were sitting on the grass. The tea basket was repacked, ready to be taken back to the house, and Colin was lying against his cushions with heavy locks pushed back from his forehead, his face looking quite a natural color. "I don't want this afternoon to go," he said, "but I shall come back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after that." "You'll get plenty of fresh air, won't you?" said Mary. "I'm going to get nothing else," he answered. "I've seen the spring now, and I'm going to see the summer. I'm going to see everything grow here. I'm going to grow here myself." "That thou will," said Deacon. "Us'll have thee walking about here and digging, same as other folks afore long." Colin flushed tremendously. "Walk?" he said. "Dig? Shall I?" Deacon's face glanced at him, and he was delicately cautious. Neither he nor Mary had ever asked if anything was actually wrong with his legs. "For sure thou will," he said stoutly. Thou's got legs of thy own, same as other folks." Mary was rather frightened until she heard Colin's answer. "Well, nothing really ails them," he says, "but they're so thin and weak, they shake so that I'm afraid to try to stand on them." Both Mary and Deacon drew a relieved breath. "When thou stops being afraid, thou'll stand on 'em," Deacon said with a renewed cheer, "and thou'll stop being afraid after a bit." "I shall?" said Colin, and he lay still, as if he were wondering about things. They were really very quiet for a little while. The sun was dropping lower. It was that hour when everything steels itself, and they really had had a busy and exciting afternoon. Colin looked as if he were resting luxuriantly. Even the creatures had ceased moving about, and had drawn together and were resting near them. Soot had perched on a low branch and drawn up one leg, and dropped the gray film drowsily over his eyes. Mary privately thought he looked as if he might snore in a minute. In the midst of this stillness, it was rather startling when Colin half lifted his head and exclaimed in a loud, suddenly alarmed whisper, "Who is that man?" Deacon and Mary scrambled to their feet. "Man!" they both cried in low, quick voices. Colin pointed to the wall. "Look!" he whispered excitedly. "Just look!" Mary and Deacon wheeled about and looked, and there was Ben Weatherstaff's indignant face glaring at them over the wall from the top of a ladder. He actually shook his fist at Mary. "If I wasn't a bachelor and thou was a wench of mine," he cried, "I'd give thee a good hiding." He mounted another step threateningly, as if it were his energetic intention to jump down and deal with her. But as she came towards him, he evidently thought better of it, and stood on the top step of his ladder, shaking his fist down at her. "I never thought much of thee," he said. "I couldn't abide thee from the first time I set eyes on thee. A scrawny, buttermilk-faced young besom, always asking questions and poking the nose where it wasn't wanted. I never knowed how that got so thick with me. If it hadn't been for the robin, drat him." "Ben Weatherstaff!" called out Mary, finding her voice at last. She stood below him and called up to him with a sort of gasp. "Ben Weatherstaff! It was the robin who showed me the way." Then it did seem as if Ben actually would scramble down on her side of the wall. He was so outraged. "The young bad 'un," he called down at her, "laying that bad business on a robin. Not but what he's impudent enough for anything, him showing thee the way. Him Ha! She could see his next words burst out because he was overpowered by curiosity. However in the world did thou get in? It was the robin that showed me the way, she protested obstinately. He didn't know he was doing it, but he did, and I can't tell you from here while you're shaking your fist at me. He stopped shaking his fist very suddenly, and at that moment his jaw actually dropped as he stared over her head at something he saw coming over the grass toward him. At the first sound of his torrent of words, Colin had been so surprised that he'd only sat there and listened as if he were spellbound. But in the midst of it he had recovered himself, and he had beckoned imperiously to Deacon. "Wheel me over there," he commanded. "Wheel me quite close and stop me right in front of him." At this, if you please, this is what Ben Weatherstaff beheld, which made his jaw drop. A wheeled chair with luxurious cushions and robes, which came towards him looking rather like some sort of state coach, because a young Rajah leaned back in it with royal command in his great black-rimmed eyes, and a thin white hand extended haughtily towards him. And it stopped right under Ben Weatherstaff's nose. It was really no wonder his mouth dropped open. "Do you know who I am?" demanded the Rajah. How Ben Weatherstaff stared. His red old eyes fixed themselves on what was before him as if he were seeing a ghost. He gazed and gazed, and he gulped a lump down his throat, and he did not say a word. "Do you know who I am?" demanded Colin, still more imperiously. "Answer!" Ben Weatherstaff put his gnarled hand up and passed it over his eyes and over his forehead, and then he did answer in a strange, shaky voice. "Who thou art?" he said. "Aye, that I do, with the mother's eyes staring at me out of the face. Lord knows how thou come here, but thou art the poor cripple." Colin forgot that he had ever had a back. His face flushed scarlet, and he sat bolt upright. "I'm not a cripple," he cried out furiously. "I'm not." "He's not," cried Mary, almost shouting up the wall in her fierce indignation. "He's not got a lump as big as a pin. I looked, and there was none, not one." Ben Weatherstaff paused, his hand over his forehead again, and he gazed as if he could never gaze enough. His hand shook, and his mouth shook, and his voice shook. He was an ignorant old man, and a tactless old man, and he could only remember the things he had heard. Thou hasn't got a crooked back?" he said hoarsely. "No!" shouted Colin. Thou hasn't got crooked legs?" Ben asked. It was too much. The strength which Colin usually threw into his tantrums rushed through him now in a new way. Never yet had he been accused of crooked legs, even in whispers, and the perfectly simple belief in their existence, which was revealed by Ben Weatherstaff's voice, was more than Rajah flesh and blood could endure. His anger and insulted pride made him forget everything but this one moment, and filled him with a power he had never known before, an almost unnatural strength. "Come here," he shouted to Deacon, and he actually began to tear the coverings off his lower limbs and disentangle himself. Come here this minute." Deacon was by his side in a second. Mary caught her breath in a short gasp and felt herself turn pale. "He can do it, he can do it, he can do it, he can do it." She said this over and over to herself as fast as she ever could. There was a brief fierce scramble. The rugs were tossed on the ground. Deacon held Colin's arm. The thin legs were out. The thin feet were on the grass. Colin was standing upright. upright, as straight as an arrow, and looking strangely tall, his head thrown back, and his strange eyes flashing lightning. "Look at me," he flung up at Ben Weatherstaff. "Just look at me, you. Just look at me." "He's as straight as I am," cried Deacon. "He's as straight as any lad in Yorkshire." What Ben Weatherstaff did, Mary thought strange beyond measure. He choked, and he gulped, and suddenly tears ran down his weather-wrinkled cheeks, and he struck his old hands together. "Eh," he burst forth, "the lies folks tells. Thou art thin as a lath, and white as a wraith, but there's not a knob on thee. Thou'll make a man yet. God bless thee." Deacon held Colin's arm strongly, but the boy had not begun to falter. He stood straighter and straighter, and he looked Ben Weatherstaff right in the face. "I'm your master," he said, "when my father's away, and you are to obey me. This is my garden. Don't dare to say a word about it. You get down from that ladder, and you go out to the long walk, and Miss Mary will meet you and bring you here. I want to talk to you. We did not want you, but now you will have to be in on the secret. Now be quick." Ben Weatherstaff's crabbed old face was still wet with that one strange rush of tears. It seemed as if he could not take his eyes from the thin, straight Colin standing on his feet with his head thrown back. "Eh, lad?" he almost whispered. "Eh, my lad?" And then he remembered himself and suddenly touched his hat in gardener fashion and said, "Yes, sir, yes, sir," and obediently disappeared behind the descending ladder.